You're listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
When Professor Bethke first suggested that I present this this workshop, I was very much afraid that I would be disappointing to you. The rather immodest title of this workshop, My Career as an Austrian Economist, I had serious doubts whether I had enough material to fill the time slot. My career sounds as if I had a lot to say, but really there's much less than it might seem. So I indicated that to Professor Bethke, and the brilliant academic intellectual entrepreneur that he is, he kindly arranged that some questions be sent to me. And that would hopefully help fill out the time. But when I received those questions, I realized that there was another cause for potential disappointment. And that is because the questions assume that I'm at the center of modern Austrian economics. The questions assume that I'm fully up to date on the interface between modern Austrian economics and the mainstream. And the questions assume that I can give useful advice to young Austrian economists in their academic research. The questions assume that my own career covers the entire gamut, the entire canvas of Austrian economics. And unfortunately, that's not true. All of that is not true. The truth is that my career has covered a very important and very central part of Austrian economics, but by no means all of Austrian economics. I've been retired now for about 15 years, and during this time I have not properly kept up with the literature, either with the Austrian economic literature or with the mainstream literature. So when I refer to the mainstream, I'm thinking about the 1980s, the graduate textbooks of the 1980s. And on top of it, I have a long-standing conviction that professors should stop writing after they reach the age 75. From time to time, people like Professor Bethke have twisted my arm to write something, even though I'm a little bit over 75. But the truth is that I'm convinced that there are rapid negative returns after a certain age. So given all this, when the questions came, I was really disturbed, and I hope that I won't be as disappointing to you as I have feared. Nonetheless, despite all of these misgivings, I have undertaken to address this workshop, and I feel privileged to do so. It is a wonderful feeling to meet so many young people who are interested in this kind of work. I can assure you, you wouldn't have had a workshop like this 30, 40 years ago. So what I think I can offer is an old man's recollections of his half-century active participation in a very exciting episode in the history of modern economic thought. And I'm going to give you these recollections in spite of bothersome lapses of detailed memory and unmistakable signs of oncoming intellectual arthritis. But I'll do my best. In general, if you want to know anything about my career, the best person to ask about my career is Professor Betke. He knows my work much better than I do. He certainly read it more recently than I have. And I do apologize for hardly at all responding to the really excellent probing questions that were sent to me. I'm not going to be able to address those questions, as I indicated. I never heard of Austrian economics until I was a graduate student. I was an economics major as an undergraduate, and I had never heard of Austrian economics. The closest that I came to Austrian economics was not by name. I grew up in Cape Town, in South Africa, and a sister of mine was a student of Professor Hutt, who was certainly not an Austrian, but at least had rubbed shoulders with some Austrians, certainly with Hayek and others at London. But otherwise, I had not even heard of anything remotely related to Austrian economics until I became a graduate student. I became a graduate student looking for graduate courses in accounting. I had finished my, when I went to college, I went to college intending to become an accountant. And as it happened, the college that I went to had all its accounting courses in economics. You can begin to understand the nature of the college. All its accounting courses were part of the economics department. So I graduated with an economics major, but I didn't have enough accounting courses to become a CPA. So, okay, I would go get a Master of Business Administration degree when I would complete the necessary courses. And I signed up at New York University's Graduate School of Business. And there were certain required courses for a Master of Business Administration degree. So it didn't matter to me which courses I took. And I had to take some courses in economics. I wasn't interested in those at all. But if I'm taking the courses, I wanted to take them with the most illustrious people around. So there was this person, Mises, who seemed to have a lot of publications. So I said, well, why didn't I sign up for his courses? And I did. And in September '54, that's when I started my graduate education, I attended the first session of Mises' seminar, September '54. I remember, and I've often cited this, I remember two things from that session. First of all, I remember Mises making some rather strange remark. The market is a process. No, I didn't know what he was talking about. I thought I knew what a market was, but a process? The market is a process, okay? That was one thing that I remember from that first seminar. And the other thing that I remember from that seminar was some very laudatory remarks that Mises made about Murray Rothbard. Murray was present at that time. He had apparently given Mises a paper that he had written, and Mises was complimenting Murray Rothbard for that paper, and he expressed his conviction that Murray would continue to produce important work. Those are the only things that I remember from there. Most of my courses were with non-Austrians at the Graduate School of Business, in New York University Graduate School of Business. I took History of Thought with Louis Haney, and that did introduce me sort of at a textbook level with the Austrian school. Haney, like other historians of thought, just talked about the Austrian school as an antique, something that once existed. There were footnotes referring to Mises and Hayek as still being alive and publishing, but it was very clear that the Austrian school was something belonging to the history of thought, strictly if not to the ancient history of thought, but to the history of thought. Okay, I was a student of Bill Peterson, who was an enthusiastic follower of Mises. And he very often gave me a ride up to the Mises seminar. The Mises seminar was held at the Washington Square campus, at number 6 Washington Square North. The Graduate School of Business was downtown at Trinity Place. And Bill Peterson used to give me a ride very often to the Mises seminar. I've often recalled that one evening a week I would take a standard price theory course under an economist by the name of Sol Fabricant. It's not a widely known name these days, but he was an important economist, by no means a price theorist, but he gave a course in price theory. And the textbook was George Stigler's Theory of Price. And I was a dutiful student of that book and that course. And of course, in another night, I would be exposed to Mises' seminar, and that muddled me tremendously. The contrast between the one night a week when I was studying Stiglerian price theory, and the night of the week that I was listening to this strange talk of Austrian economics, that confused me. And it confused me for about 10 years until I got things straight. By the end of my first year as a graduate student, I had decided I was not going to become an accountant. I received my Master of Business Administration in June '55. And I had applied to Johns Hopkins to continue my studies in economics. And I'm not sure why I had the guts to do so, but I went to Mises and asked his advice. Should I accept this fellowship offer at Hopkins, or should I stay at NYU? And I've always thought of this as a matter of great integrity on the part of Mises. He told me, go to Hopkins. Now, I would like you to realize that at that time, Mises had virtually no students. He had people around the seminar table, but he had no real students who were interested in an academic career under his tutelage. And yet, Mises told me, go to Hopkins. Machlap is a good teacher, he said. Machlap is a good teacher. So, but I didn't. I stayed with Mises. And Mises immediately, as soon as I told him that I was planning to stay, he immediately arranged a fellowship for me at NYU. It was an Earhart Fellowship. What he told me to do was to write a paper. He gave me a topic for the paper. And I'm always extremely grateful for that paper. If I was to talk about my career as an Austrian economist, I would say that my career was based on that paper, which was entirely at the suggestion of Mises. The suggestion that he gave me was to focus on the on the contrast between Lionel Robbins' 1932 book, The Nature and Significance of Economics, and the Misesian human action approach. And I wrote my paper, I received my fellowship, and eventually I used that topic as the basis for my doctoral dissertation, which became eventually my first book, The Economic Point of View, of 1960. But I have to confess that I didn't really understand. Although I wrote a paper and I wrote a dissertation and published a book, I didn't really understand the importance of that topic that Mises had suggested until about 10 years later. I must say that I spent most of those 10 years reading Human Action, along with other material, of course. But I found Human Action a very, very difficult book, as many of you have found it. It's a very difficult book. Mises was unfortunately not a skillful writer in English. He was not able to transmit his ideas, at least not to me, in a clear way. It took me about 10 years until I understood, and I don't claim to have understood everything in Human Action, but it took me 10 years of study, and of course study in other branches, other schools of economic thought, to understand the nuances of Misesian economics. And it was only till about 19 that would have been around the late 60s that I felt that I really understood what set Mises apart and why his work in Austrian economics was so important. Let me say a few words about the Mises seminar in those years. Mises had a seminar, and in that seminar there were two types of people in that seminar. It was around a seminar table in a very ornate room in Washington Square North, 6 Washington Square North. Mises used to describe it as a seminar taking place in a saloon. What he meant was a salon, I guess, but he was trying to be English, so he says in a saloon. So around that table, there were two types of people. There were people who took the seminar to get 3 credits. These were people who were working hard during the day in Wall Street. They were taking graduate courses for a master's in business administration, and they knew that they would get an easy pass. There was no exam, there was no requirement, and you simply had to attend. And if you attended, you got full credit. So they would come and enjoy the siesta. They were fast asleep. That's what I meant when I said Mises had no students. It really had. The people who came, the students, were simply there to sleep. Mrs. Mises she didn't fall asleep, I can assure you. And at 9:10, which was the time when the seminar was supposed to conclude, 7:25 to 9:10 was the time slot, she would be waving to her husband, alerting him to the time. It's time to stop. It's time to stop the seminar. But this, as I say, the one type of person was these quasi-students. The other type of person was wonderful people who were not academics at all, not students at all. There were people like Larry Fertig, like Bettina Greaves, who were not academicians at all, not students, not academicians. They were enthusiasts of Mises. And they would gather around Mises to protect him from any questions. If you asked a question of Mises, these defenders of Mises would think you're trying to somehow hurt him, and they would immediately react. It was not a healthy situation. It was not a healthy situation. The Misesian approach was seen as a dogma, which if you're here, you better show respect for it. You don't ask questions. You don't question that dogma. And I would like to say a few words about that culture surrounding Mises in those years. It was not a healthy culture. I understand how it developed. Mises, of course, in Europe, had been a prominent academician. In Vienna, in Switzerland, he had been a world-famous economist. His books were widely known and respected. They may have been treated as to some extent old-fashioned, as maybe as out of style, one way or another, but at least his academic standing was unquestioned. In the United States, he came as an older person. He came in his 60s. He was not treated well. He was not treated well. He was never offered the kind of academic position that he was really warranted. He never received such a position, and he became to be cherished by a group of non-academicians who, with the healthiest of motives and the healthiest of reasons, tried to protect him. And this attitude tended to emphasize and to reinforce a general understanding that Mises had no position, no standing in academic circles. And that was most unfortunate. That was most unfortunate. I understand how this happened. I do understand how this happened. And I have the highest respect for those who tried to protect him. Someone like Larry Furtick I believe, a member of the Board of Trustees of the New York University, and it was he who arranged Mises' visiting professorship. He was never a regular faculty member at the university. His salary was paid from the outside, and it was Furtick who ensured that he would have at least this standing at the university. People like Henry Hazlitt. Hazlitt was a brilliant writer and deep economic understanding, but he was no academician. He was not an academician. And others at the time, there were people who were close to, young people who were close to Murray Rothbard, people like George Reisman, and others, Ron Hammaway, and others at that time. They would come to in the seminar, but none of them were really students in the sense that you'd expect a person like Mises to be able to project to a new generation of young people who could understand what he was about. And I must say, this aura of dogma that surrounds Mises has not completely been dissipated. And from time to time, I've found it necessary to draw attention to that and to criticize it. It's important that Mises should be exposed to criticism. People have to understand Mises. Mises is not easy to understand. I've no guarantee that everything that Mises said is the truth, but I've also long ago found that it's very difficult to say Mises is wrong. The reason why you can't say Mises is wrong, because you probably haven't understood what he was trying to say. That's really the truth. Mises, as I say, his exposition in English was less than ideal, and I've found again and again that it's necessary to dig deeper beneath the prose of Mises to get to what he was saying. So I'm very careful before I say Mises is wrong. I may not agree with Mises, I may not understand it, I may not accept it, but I've learned long ago that one is on slippery ground if you simply, I've understood Mises and he's wrong. It's very difficult to say that. Nonetheless, that's not the same thing as the dogmatic acceptance of everything that Mises said. And when I was writing my competition entrepreneurship, one of the things I had in mind was to translate Mises into language that the mainstream of the profession could appreciate and understand. That was the purpose, and I believe it's necessary it's only through that type of work that Austrian economics has succeeded as it has to become part of the conversation among economists in general. So I'm paying a good deal of attention to this aura of dogmatism that surrounded the Mises seminar. I understand how it emerged, and I don't believe Mises himself was to blame for that. Although I do recognize that Mises could be very angry at people who disagreed with him. I understand that. My impression was, I must say, after reading the recollections of people who had participated in Mises' seminar in Vienna, it's my understanding, my impression, no more than an impression, understanding, that during those years, Mises was open-minded and let anyone say whatever he wanted, okay? And it was perfectly okay to disagree with Mises. It was perfectly okay. After having spent most of his life listening to all kinds of nonsense, patiently listening to all kinds of nonsense, Mises in his old age, when one gets older, one gets impatient. Mises in his old age came to feel he's heard all that before. Nonsense, it's time to call it nonsense. And that's perhaps the reason why in his American era, Mises projected the impression of being intolerant and not open to criticism. I think that during the central years of his career in Vienna and in Switzerland, that was not the case. Once again, I do wish to show appreciation, to extend my appreciation for the role of the non-academic supporters of Mises. Particularly, I would mention the role of the Foundation for Economic Education. Leonard Read, who led the foundation, was an outstanding intellectual figure. He gave Mises a base. The NYU was not his base. The Foundation for Economic Education was a base for Mises. He gave him a certain stability, and I have the highest regard for the work that Leonard Read did for Mises. And I must say, when in the late 60s, when I was in need of funding to continue my research, it was Leonard Read who put me in touch with sources of funding, which eventually made possible the Austrian program that at NYU that Professor Betke has kindly mentioned. Okay. So although I'm criticizing to some extent the non-academic aura that surrounded Mises at FEE as well, at Foundation for Economic Education as well, I do not wish to be misunderstood. I have the highest regard and the deepest appreciation for what Leonard Read and the Foundation for Economic Education and others such as Larry Fertig and Henry Hazlitt were able to do for Mises. Let me go back to the term Austrian economics. I remember at the time I was taking my oral exams for the PhD at NYU, Professor Kuiper, he was the leading economist at that time in the department. Professor Kuiper, after all kinds of questions and so on, he asked me, "Do you identify yourself as an Austrian economist?" And I was taken aback, and I said, "Yes." And he says, "Well, I don't." And I thought that was the end of it. So the term Austrian economics at that time, Austrian economist, was not a term of celebration. This. I remember one of my senior colleagues in the department at NYU, when he found out that I was writing my dissertation under Mises, he says, "Mises? He hasn't had a new idea in 20 years." That was his reaction. And he was generally sympathetic to the free market approach of Mises. Nonetheless, that was the picture. In September '57, on receiving my degree, I began teaching at NYU in the School of Commerce. I received a Volker Fellowship that released me from teaching in order to write up my dissertation. My dissertation had been on the definitions of economics, as I indicated earlier, but in order to finish my dissertation on time, I cut off that history at the year 1900. But I completed that and recast it not in chronological terms but in topical terms for my book, Economic Point of View. And as I mentioned earlier, that book is certainly to be traced back to the topic that Mises gave me several years earlier, assigned to me several several years earlier, and I believe that it's that topic that has been the backbone of my own research work throughout my career. But as I mentioned earlier, it was only by the end of the 60s, it was 10 years after I began teaching, that I really felt that I understood what Mises was about, what the real difference between Robbins and Mises really was, and why that was of crucial importance. You have to understand that Robbins was very much under Austrian influence. If you look at the 1932 book, you'll see in the preface that he extends his recognition of the time spent in Vienna. The writers that he cites are prominent Austrians, including Hayek, Mises, and others. He was writing that book under Austrian influence, but it was the Austrian influence of the 1920s. It's important to recognize that it was the Austrian influence of the 1920s. And Mises always had a high respect for Robbins, but he in assigning the topic that I mentioned earlier, he was interested in drawing a sharp line of distinction between the Robbins definition of economics and the Misesian human action identification of economics. The writing of the economic point of view, particularly the writing of the last two chapters, did a lot to force me to dig into that difference. But I still did. It took me 10 years till I understood the real meaning of that difference between Robbins and Mises. I thought I had it in my 1960 book. In chapter 6, I dealt with Robbins. In chapter 7, the final chapter, I dealt with Mises. And I thought that I had the distinction clear. And I think what I wrote in that book was correct and valid. But I still didn't get to the depth of the Misesian insight until about 10 years later. Meantime, in the 60s, what I identified as the essence of Austrian economics was not Misesian human action. I didn't identify that as the central idea. I identified the central idea as subjectivism, which makes a lot of sense. That's what the definition of Austrian economics is all about. The history of Austrian economics is a history of subjectivist thought in economics, as distinct from the classical physicalist approach to economic understanding. The systematic chains of cause and effect that pervade economic systems was identified by the classicists as generated by the physical reality. It was Menger and his colleagues and the Austrian school particularly that emphasized that the source of these chains of cause and systematic chains of cause and effect is the subjective decision making by participating individuals. Okay, so after my economic point of view, I set about writing a textbook that would present the standard price theory as in terms of the subjectivist emphasis. The work that I found most helpful in writing that book was Wicksteed. Philip Wicksteed, the British economist, who was a subjectivist. He had almost nothing to do with Austrian economics, nothing to do with the Mengerian school, but he was a self-taught economist, subjectivist economist, and the explanations that he gave for market regularities and market chains of causation were extremely helpful to me, and they were the basis, along with Mises and to some extent Hayek. They were the basis for my 1963 textbook on price theory. I have to say about that textbook, I think that that is a unique textbook. I don't think it was adopted anywhere. Maybe I adopted it for some, maybe I used it. But otherwise, I don't think it was adopted anywhere. So this was a unique textbook. I look back at that textbook with a lot of satisfaction. I think it translated into textbook form a lot of what I had absorbed from Mises and Hayek and Wicksteed in a systematic way. And I have as I say, I do feel satisfied with the book. I don't believe it reached down to the full meaning of Austrian economics or Misesian economics. So I certainly wouldn't write that book the way I wrote it then. I wouldn't now write that book the way I wrote it then. But what I did then was, I think, an honest attempt to present standard price theory as in strictly subjectivist terms, decision-making terms, process terms. This much I had certainly absorbed from Mises, that the market is a process. By that time, I certainly understood what Mises meant when he had said that market is a process. The market is a process. It's a process of decision-making. It's a process of revisions in decision-making. And what I tried to do is to present price theory in its process sense, rather than as an equilibrium exercise, series of equilibrium exercises. This was my 1963 book. I do recall that when that book was given out to review, it was review in manuscript form before it was published. Murray Rothbard commented on that. I believe Pete, in his introduction to the Liberty Fund issue, cites that. But I recall that very well, very clearly. He criticized this as carrying water on both shoulders. In other words, I was being criticized as being an Austrian, and trying to be a mainstream economist at the same time. And there is, I recognize that may be some basis for that comment. I wouldn't necessarily call it a criticism, but there was some basis for that. I was trying to present standard price theory as perceived through subjectivist lenses. From a perspective that recognizes that all the regularities that standard economics does present us with, those regularities are to be traced back to individual decision makers, to decisions being made and being revised. And I think that book was I think a satisfactory presentation of where I stood at that time. My next work was an essay on capital. And here again, I was simply trying to be a subjectivist. I was simply trying to make sense out of the mass of material. Professor White here is sitting here, and he knows how confusing and how complex and how difficult the material and capital theory is. Professor White has written a superb, presented a superb edition of Hayek's Pure Theory of Capital. What I was trying to do in my little 1966 book was to go through that literature and sort of make sense out of it in purely subjectivist terms. And that was not easy. And I found myself grappling, disagreeing with Hayek, disagreeing with Baumgartner, sharply disagreeing with Frank Knight, of course, but I believe making sense out of capital, the concept of capital, and how capital enters into economic understanding. So I look back at that book with a great deal of satisfaction. Later on, I republished it as part of a book entitled Essays on Capital and Interest, This was called an essay on capital, and I had added on a few pieces on interests that I had written based on basically Misesian ideas of pure time preference theory. And I was hoping that that would gel to some extent with the essay on capital. But you notice that all my work through these years in the early 60s was based on this understanding Austrian economics and Misesian economics as fundamentally subjectivist, meaning that economic phenomena have to be traced back to the decision. But the notion of a decision was not fundamentally changed from what standard economists understood by a decision. I understood that a decision represented, as Robbins had taught us, a constrained maximization exercise. Everybody who starts micro theory recognizes that decisions are constrained maximization exercises. One wishes to maximize goals with a given means. You're constrained by your means, and you want to achieve an allocation pattern that maximizes your attainment of goals within the constraints imposed by your means. And I think that was fine as far as it went, but I repeat, this is still because I was still busy reading Human Action. This was still during the first 10 years, and I was still busy reading Human Action. By the end of the 60s, I saw the light. What happened was, I remember it very clearly. I remember the exact place where I was when I saw the light. I had been invited to present a paper at the Mont Pelerin Society meeting in Vichy, I believe it was at the time. That was 1967, I believe, 68, 67, 68, Vichy meeting of Mont Pelerin Society. And while I was preparing that paper, I began to realize that when Mises was talking about human action, he was defining human action in entrepreneurial terms. Mises says it directly. He said every decision is an entrepreneurial decision. He says that. But I hadn't quite realized what he meant. The difference between Robbins and Mises was the difference between a non-entrepreneurial view of the decision and a Misesian entrepreneurial view of the decision, which Mises called human action. I had never understood why Mises chose human action as the name of his treatise on economics. It seemed to me a crazy title. It seemed to me to be absolutely senseless to call a book on economics human action. And yet, I still believe that Mises was not successful in projecting what he was trying to do. It took me 10 years to get what he was trying to get. But he was getting at the point that decision-making is not an exercise in constrained maximization. He was getting at the insight that every decision is an entrepreneurial decision. We live in an open-ended world where when you make a decision, you're not choosing an allocation pattern within a given framework. You are choosing your framework. You are identifying your framework. That is the human action concept. That is the entrepreneurial concept. And that transforms all economics. Once you've got that, you've got a different understanding of economics. And as I say, it took me 10 years to grasp that insight of Mises. And as I say, it was in my preparing the paper for the Mont Pelerin Society meeting, and Professor Betke has picked on that paper as the beginning of my work on competition entrepreneurship, and he was absolutely right. That is Professor Betke's editorial genius in identifying that particular paper. During the 60s, I began a correspondence with Ludwig Lachmann. Lachmann was a unique person in modern Austrian economics. He was not an Austrian economist. Let me say that outright. He was not an Austrian economist. But without him, Austrian economics would not exist today. Okay? He wrote to me soon after I published my economic point of view in the early 60s. And he would write a letter. I would respond after a few weeks or months. I wasn't a very prompt, punctual correspondent. But after a while, I would respond and thank him for the letter. And this went on for many, many years. Many years. I have a big pile of correspondence with Lachmann on that. And when you look at it from the long-run perspective, from the perspective of my career as an Austrian economist, when you look at it from the long-run perspective, you have to recognize that was important in my career. First of all, it made me feel less lonely. You've no idea how lonely I was as an economist. I'm happily married. But you've no idea how lonely I was as an economist, okay? And here was a professor of economics, he held the chair, in the British Empire. The chair of economics is you're the whole department. So he had the chair of economics at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and he was writing to me. I felt the honor that that this was doing to me, and he was interested. And I began to realize that this was a kindred spirit. He seemed to have a high regard for Mises. I say seemed because later on, after 20 years or so, I realized that he couldn't stand Misesian economics. But it took me, he was so polite. Lachmann was so polite, it took me years and years to realize that he and I didn't agree on anything. But that correspondence was of great value to me, of great value. First of all, he took away the feeling of academic loneliness, okay? And also it widened my perspective. He was a student of Hayek from London. He was, of course, Shackle. He was associated with Shackle's work. The proudest thing that Lachmann, what gave Lachmann the greatest pride was where Shackle would quote him. As in one of his books, he felt tremendously proud of that. And Lachmann's contribution to the development of Austrian economics was extremely important. I had the privilege of inviting Ludwig Lachmann to NYU when he retired from University of Witwatersrand in the 70s. I was able to bring him, and I must say, Fritz Machlup was helpful in getting him approved in the department. I was able to get him accepted as a visiting professor in the department, and he came for quite a number of years, and he had a great contribution. He made a great contribution to the development of the Austrian program at New York University. As I say, somewhere along the line, I realized that he and I disagreed on basically everything in economics. But he was not only tremendously polite, he was very careful not to criticize anybody, but he was also very profound. He was extremely profound. And his criticism of Austrian economics was very healthy for our own students. Many of them were able to develop their own thinking primarily through the interaction with Ludwig Lachmann around the seminar table, their colloquia, and by long discussions with him. I have my reservations about some of the consequences of that interaction, but I always feel a great sense of appreciation to Ludwig Lachmann, and for not only for what he meant for me personally in my career, but for what he meant for us, for Austrian economics. Let me say something about South Royalton. In 1974, there was a conference held at South Royalton. South Royalton, I've never heard of it till then. I don't believe it means anything to me except for this conference. It's a forlorn place, but the entrepreneurial genius of people like George Pearson was responsible for a conference held in the early 70s at a time when Austrian economics was still very much in its infancy in the United States. I recall at a meeting before the conference was launched, before it was the planning was sort of set, there was a discussion what to call it. Should we call it a conference on Austrian economics? Or something else. I don't remember the other alternatives. But finally it was understood it was going to be a conference on Austrian economics. And that was a conference in which they were able to identify about 30 or 40 people who had some affinity to Misesian, Hayekian, non-Chicago type of economics. Okay, and the three lecturers there were Mary Rothbard, Ludwig Lachmann, and myself. Okay, I'm the only survivor of those lecturers, but that conference was extremely important. It brought together many individuals who were not sure where they belonged. Many of them came with, if they would have asked them, are you in Austrian economics? They would say, no, I'm not in Austrian economics. I have sympathies with it and so on. But that conference was an important historical episode. As I've indicated, I believe it was an extraordinarily successful academic entrepreneurial venture. In which George Pearson and others, which they launched. Okay, at the same time, this conference introduced Lachmann to the wider group of American Austrians. It also, I believe, it accentuated certain differences between Mary Rothbard and myself on doctrinal and other issues. Okay. And that all of that has been important in the subsequent history of Austrian economics. It was in those years that I was able to bring to NYU young scholars like Mario Rizzo and Gerald O'Driscoll, and we were able to launch the colloquium, the Austrian colloquium at NYU, which proceeded for many years, and which still continues under a slightly different title. But that was extremely important. Professor Lachmann was there, and it was, I believe, it was an important stage in the development of modern Austrian economics. To indicate the difference between the atmosphere at that time and the atmosphere today, is I remember in 1981, I was participating in some meeting in Vienna. And I made the announcement, I don't know why I made such a provocative announcement, but I said, I believe I'm the only Austrian economist in the room. It didn't go down well. I apologize, I'm not the only Austrian economist in the room today. But at that time, I remember I made that comment, and that I think captures the sense in which one was lonely in the academic profession of economics at that time. This was in the early 80s, 81. I've not mentioned one earlier episode which I think was important in my own career. And that was an exchange which I had with Gary Becker. This was in the early 60s, 1962. Gary Becker had written a paper in which he thought he was able to liberate economics from the rationality assumption. The rationality assumption was philosophically excess baggage. I shouldn't say excess baggage. It was inconvenient baggage, because not everybody seems to be rational and so on. And if economics is based on the rationality assumption, that seems to make it somewhat unrealistic. And so Becker at that time thought he had a way of showing that the downward sloping demand curve didn't depend on the rationality assumption. Or standard microeconomics talks about maximizing decisions on the part of consumers, and that explains how when price goes down, people want to buy more and so on. And he believed that by showing, which he may have been successful in showing, that you can generate a downward sloping demand curve without any rationality hypothesis. He believed that was a great methodological advance for economics, because it liberated economics from the rationality assumption. And what I pointed out was, this had to do with the process idea, with strictly Misesian idea, I pointed out that the rationality assumption is not crucial so much for the fact that it explains why demand curves slope down. It's crucial for explaining why price tends to gravitate towards the intersection of supply and demand curves. Why, when you have started out from an initial above equilibrium price, why does price tend to fall? You can't explain that without rationality. The rationality assumption means that people change their decisions on the basis of what they realize is the truth. That's where the rationality assumption comes in. And it was that was an exchange which I had. And I repeat, this was in 1962, 5 years before I had fully understood what Mises was about with the entrepreneurial idea. But this was a step. This was, I think, a significant step towards that realization. Most of what I've done since the 80s, there's one book that I wrote in the 80s having to do with the distributive justice, which I think is a book that has perhaps been to some extent ignored. I believe it was a significant contribution to the theory of justice, economic justice, theory of distribution. It was an entrepreneurial, it was an attempt to understand the distributive system in entrepreneurial terms. Okay, but beyond that, most of our work has been in terms of history, the history of the Austrian development since World War II, or since before, it's the decade before World War II, from the mid-30s and on. And that's because I've always felt, and I've presented this many, many times, I'll be presenting it in the Austrian seminar this evening, I've always believed that there was a dramatic episode in the history of thought, that Austrian economics, which was virtually written off by the end of the 30s, in fact, during the next decade, presented dramatic advance in the work of Hayek and Mises. It wasn't recognized at the time. I don't believe Hayek and Mises recognized what they were doing. But they were radically deepening the body of Austrian theory which they had received. And their work in that, I believe, needs to be underlined and emphasized. And most of my work since then has been along those lines. Let me conclude by making a remark on mathematical economics. For a long time, people had the idea, well, Austrian economics is non-mathematical economics, which could mean that Austrian economists are not smart enough to do mathematical economics. I guess that's true for me, but I don't think it's true for all Austrians. Okay. I think that the important reason why Austrian economics has not emphasized mathematics is because Austrian economics is a matter of insight. Insight. What do I mean by a matter of insight? Supposing somebody tells you that the price of the screwdriver depends on the rate of interest. Well, the insight that the decisions that govern the price of screwdrivers depends on the rate of interest, that's a set of insights that can be expressed in mathematical terms after you've got the insight. But you first have to get the insight. The idea that when people exchange, there's mutual benefit is something that you can put into mathematical terms, but it's a matter of insight. Recognizing human purposes is a matter of insight. Austrian economics is a matter of insight. When I say it took me 10 years to understand what Mises was trying to say, it took me 10 years to get that insight into the Misesian system. Okay? And that is why I'm not in any way criticizing mathematical economics. I'm pointing out what mathematical economics cannot do. It cannot substitute for insight. And economists must be able to deploy their insight. You can talk about constrained maximization, but constrained maximization does not convey the insight that people notice opportunities. Noticing an opportunity is something that's outside the mathematical formulation. It's a matter of insight. And I believe that as I look back on my career, okay, I believe that what I've been able to achieve for myself is to recognize the insightful content of Misesian economics, not to claim that everything that Mises wrote was true or correct or valid. I'm not claiming that. I'm claiming that Mises, in spite of his inability to convey those insights in a comfortable and easy, convenient way, nonetheless was able to get at the truth in a way that's deeper than can be achieved in any other way. I look back on Hayek's work as extremely important and valuable. His exposition was superb. I believe that the Misesian insights go to some extent beyond the Hayekian insights. And it's that in that sense that I am privileged to consider myself a student of Ludwig von Mises. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.